Buried secrets. The sun hung low over the Warrington estate, a sprawling expanse of rolling hills and ancient oaks that whispered of old money and older secrets. The grand manor loomed on the horizon, its stone facade catching the last golden rays like a cold, unblinking eye. But far from the manicured lawns and marble halls, in a secluded meadow tucked behind a copse of gnarled trees, a scene was unfolding that would stain the earth with betrayal. The air was heavy with the scent of damp soil and impending dusk, a stillness broken only by the faint rustle of leaves and the distant call of a solitary crow. Charles Warrington stood at the meadow's edge, his charcoal suit impeccably tailored, though his polished shoes were already dusted with earth. His face was a study in control, sharp jawline, thin lips pressed into a line, and eyes like flint, glinting with a purpose that chilled the warm September air. In his hands, he held a shovel, its blade gleaming dully in the fading light. Before him, his 5-year-old twin daughters, Elise and Clara, sat on the grass, their matching blue dresses rumpled, their golden curls catching the breeze. Their small hands were clasped together, their wide blue eyes fixed on their father with a mixture of confusion and trust. "Daddy, what are we doing out here?" Elise asked, her voice soft but curious. She tilted her head, her curls bouncing slightly. "Are we planting flowers like Mommy used to?" Charles' smile was a practiced thing, tight and unnatural, like a mask slipping over his features. "Not quite, my darling," he said, his voice smooth as polished marble, but laced with an edge that made Clara shift uneasily. "We're playing a special game. A secret game, just for us. You're my precious jewels, and I'm going to hide you where no one can find you." Clara's brow furrowed, her small fingers tightening around Elise's. "Hide us," she echoed, her voice barely above a whisper. "But why, Daddy?" "I don't like hiding games. They're scary." "Nonsense," Charles said, his tone sharpening just enough to make the girls flinch. He knelt, bringing himself to their level, though his eyes remained cold, calculating. "You're my brave girls, aren't you? This is how we keep you safe. Now, lie down here." He gestured to 2 shallow pits he dug earlier, each barely a foot deep, their edges rough and uneven. Across the meadow, tethered to a twisted oak, stood Shadow, a black stallion whose coat gleamed like liquid midnight. His dark eyes, deep and knowing, followed Charles' every move. His ears flicked toward the girls' voices, catching the tremor in Clara's words, and his powerful frame tensed, muscles rippling beneath his glossy hide. Shadow's nostrils flared, sensing something wrong, something that stirred an instinct older than the trees around him. His hoofs pawed the earth, leaving shallow divots in the soft ground. Elise hesitated, glancing at her sister. "Daddy, is Shadow playing too?" she asked, her eyes darting to the horse. "He looks like he wants to come closer." Charles' jaw twitched, and he cast an irritated glance at the stallion. "Shadow's fine where he is," he said curtly. "He's just a horse, Elise. He doesn't understand games like we do." But his words felt hollow, even to him. There was something in Shadow's gaze, too sharp, too human, that unsettled him. He pushed the thought aside, focusing on the task at hand. The girls obeyed, lying down in the pits, their small bodies barely filling the space. They held hands, their fingers intertwining instinctively, a lifeline against the growing unease. Charles began to shovel dirt over them, the soil pattering softly against their dresses. Elise giggled at first, thinking it a strange tickle, but Clara's breath hitched, her eyes widening as the earth crept higher. "It's cold, Daddy," Clara said, her voice trembling. "And it's getting in my hair." "Can we stop now?" "Just a little more," Charles replied, his voice mechanical, as if reciting a script. He worked faster, the shovel's rhythm steady, each scoop burying his daughters deeper. Sweat beaded on his forehead, staining the collar of his pristine shirt, but his expression remained resolute. His mind was on Sylvia, his new partner, waiting in the city with promises of a life unencumbered by the past. The girls were a complication, tied to his late wife's fortune, a fortune he couldn't fully claim while they lived. This meadow, hidden from the estate's staff, was his solution. Shadow's agitation grew. He let out a sharp whinny, the sound slicing through the meadow like a warning. His tether strained, the rope creaking as he pulled against it, his hooves stomping the ground with increasing force. Charles paused, glaring at the horse. "Quiet, you beast," he muttered, his grip tightening on the shovel. But Shadow's eyes never left him, burning with an intensity that made Charles' skin prickle. "Daddy," Shadow scared, Elise said, her voice muffled by the dirt now covering her legs. "Maybe he doesn't like the game either." "Enough about the horse," Charles snapped, his composure fraying. He shoveled faster, the earth piling higher, reaching the girls' waists. Their whimpers grew louder, their small bodies shifting against the weight of the soil. Clara's free hand clawed at the dirt, a futile gesture that left her nails caked with mud. "Daddy, please," Clara sobbed, tears streaking her face. "It's too heavy." "I can't move." Charles didn't respond, his face a mask of determination. The girls were nearly buried to their chests now, their pale faces stark against the dark earth. The meadow seemed to hold its breath, the crow's call silenced, the breeze stilled. Only Shadow's restless movements broke the eerie quiet, his whinnies growing more urgent, his body straining against the rope. Then, with a sudden, violent jerk, Shadow tore free. The rope snapped, whipping through the air, and the stallion surged forward, hoofs thundering across the meadow. Charles spun around, his eyes widening in shock. "No!" he shouted, raising the shovel like a shield. Shadow's charge was a blur of black fury, his mane streaming like a battle flag, his eyes locked on the man who dared harm the innocents he'd sworn to protect. The meadow erupted into chaos, the stallion's defiance marking the beginning of a reckoning that would change everything. Buried secrets. The meadow pulsed with the thunder of Shadow's hooves, the black stallion a living storm tearing across the grass. His mane whipped like a dark flame, his eyes blazing with an unyielding fury that seemed to draw power from the very earth. Charles Warrington staggered backward, the shovel raised in his trembling hands, his charcoal suit now streaked with dirt and sweat. The air crackled with tension, the dying light of the sun casting long shadows that danced like specters around the shallow pits where Elise and Clara lay half buried, their small faces pale with terror. "Stay back, you beast!" Charles roared, his voice cracking with panic. He swung the shovel wildly, the blade slicing through the air, but Shadow was undeterred. The stallion veered at the last moment, his massive shoulders slamming into Charles with a force that sent the man sprawling. The shovel flew from his grasp, landing with a dull thud in the grass, and Charles hit the ground hard, a sharp gasp escaping his lips as the wind was knocked from him. Elise and Clara gasped in unison, their eyes wide as they watched from their earthen prisons. "Shadow!" Elise cried, her voice a mix of fear and hope. The dirt around her chest felt heavier now, pressing against her small frame, but the sight of the horse's defiance sparked something within her, a flicker of belief that they might not be abandoned after all. Clara's sobs softened, her tear-streaked face turning toward her sister. "He's fighting for us," she whispered, her fingers twitching beneath the soil, still clutching Elise's hand. "He knows Daddy's doing something bad." Charles scrambled to his knees, his pristine suit torn at the elbow, blood trickling from a scrape on his cheek where the ground had bitten him. His eyes darted between the stallion and his daughters, a wild, desperate calculation flickering in their depths. "You're ruining everything," he snarled, though it was unclear whether he spoke to Shadow or the girls. He lunged for the shovel, his fingers closing around the handle, but Shadow was faster. The stallion reared, his front hoofs pawing the air, a towering silhouette against the twilight sky. His neigh was a primal cry, echoing across the meadow like a warning to the heavens. Charles froze, the shovel slipping from his grip as he stumbled backward. "Damn you!" he shouted, his voice raw with frustration. He glanced at the girls, now buried up to their shoulders, their pale faces stark against the dark earth. For a fleeting moment, something flickered in his gaze, guilt, perhaps, or the ghost of a father he'd once been. But it vanished, swallowed by the cold resolve that had brought him to this meadow. Sylvia's voice echoed in his mind. No children, Charles. No complications. The fortune tied to the girls was his ticket to a new life, and he wouldn't let a horse, of all things, stand in his way. Shadow lowered his hooves, snorting loudly, his nostrils flaring as he positioned himself between Charles and the girls. His dark eyes never left the man, a silent vow that he would not let harm come to the innocents. The stallion's muscles were taut, ready to charge again, but he held his ground, a living barrier of strength and will. "Daddy, please stop," Elise pleaded, her voice breaking. The dirt around her neck was tight, restricting her movements, and a claustrophobic panic began to set in. "Shadow's trying to help us." "Why are you doing this?" Charles' jaw clenched, his hands balling into fists. "You don't understand," he said, his voice low and venomous. "This is for your own good. For our family." The lie tasted bitter, but he forced it out, his eyes avoiding the girls' tearful gazes. He took a cautious step toward them, testing Shadow's resolve. The stallion reacted instantly, stomping the ground with a hoof, the impact sending a tremor through the meadow. His ears pinned back, and he bared his teeth, a rare, menacing gesture that made Charles hesitate. The man's confidence wavered, his gaze darting to the horizon, where the manor's lights were just beginning to flicker on. Time was slipping away. The estate's groundskeeper, old Thomas, might come looking if Charles didn't return soon. He needed to finish this now. "Fine," Charles muttered, his voice a hiss. He circled wide, keeping Shadow in his peripheral vision, and retrieved the shovel. "We'll do this the hard way." He began shoveling again, faster now, the dirt piling over the girls' shoulders. Their cries grew frantic, their small bodies straining against the weight of the earth. "Stop it, Daddy!" Clara screamed, her voice raw. "It hurts. We can't breathe." Her free hand clawed at the soil, but it was futile, the dirt too heavy, too compact. Shadow's patience snapped. With a powerful lunge, he charged again, this time aiming directly for Charles. The man swung the shovel, catching Shadow's flank with a glancing blow, but the stallion didn't falter. His shoulders slammed into Charles' chest, sending him tumbling into a shallow ditch at the meadow's edge. Charles cried out, his ankle twisting as he landed awkwardly, the ditch's steep sides trapping him like a cage. The girls gasped, their sobs mingling with relief. "Shadow, you did it," Elise cried, her voice muffled by the dirt now creeping toward her chin. Clara nodded, her breath hitching, her eyes locked on the horse. Shadow stood at the ditch's edge, snorting, his eyes fixed on Charles. The man groaned, clutching his ankle, his face contorted with pain and rage. You'll pay for this," he spat, but his words lacked strength, swallowed by the vastness of the meadow. The stallion turned, his attention now on the girls. With careful steps, he approached them, lowering his massive head to sniff the earth around their necks. His warm breath brushed Clara's cheek, and she managed a shaky smile. "He's going to get us out," she whispered, her voice trembling with hope. Shadow began to dig, his hooves scooping away the loose soil with a precision that belied his size. Dirt flew in arcs, and the girls felt the pressure ease slightly, their shoulders emerging from the earth. But the task was immense, and the light was fading fast, the meadow cloaked in a deepening twilight. In the distance, a faint sound broke the silence, the low rumble of an engine, growing closer. Headlights flickered through the trees, a vehicle approaching the meadow. Shadow's ears pricked up, his digging pausing as he glanced toward the light. Friend or foe, he couldn't know, but his resolve remained unbroken. Charles, still in the ditch, heard the engine too. A flicker of hope crossed his face, quickly replaced by dread. "No," he muttered, struggling to climb out. Not now. The girls looked toward the lights, their hearts pounding. Someone's coming, Elise whispered, squeezing Clara's hand beneath the earth. Shadow, hurry. The meadow held its breath, the stallions' hooves moving faster, the approaching vehicle a wild card in a game where innocence hung in the balance. Buried secrets. The meadow was a canvas of twilight, its colors bleeding into shadow as the last vestiges of daylight surrendered to the encroaching night. The air vibrated with the low growl of an approaching engine, headlights slicing through the ancient oaks like twin blades. Shadow, the black stallion, paused his digging, his hooves caked with earth, his dark eyes glinting toward the light. Elise and Clara, half buried in their shallow pits, clung to each other's hands beneath the soil, their faces pale and tear-streaked, their breaths shallow against the weight of the dirt. From the ditch, Charles Warrington groaned, his twisted ankle throbbing, his mind racing for a way to salvage his unraveling plan. Shadow snorted softly, his ears twitching as the vehicle, a weathered pickup truck, rumbled into the meadow, its tires crunching over the grass. The stallion resumed digging, his hooves scooping dirt with renewed urgency, as if sensing time was slipping away. Elise's shoulders were now partially free, the earth loosened around her, but Clara remained pinned, her small chest heaving with panic. Hurry, Shadow, Elise whispered, her voice a fragile thread of hope. Someone's here. The truck's door creaked open, and Thomas, the estate's groundskeeper, stepped out. His weathered face, etched with 60 years of sun and toil, was set in a frown, his gray eyes narrowing as they swept the scene. His lantern, held aloft, cast a warm glow over the meadow, illuminating the girls' dirt-streaked faces and Shadow's gleaming coat. "What in God's name?" he muttered, his voice rough but laced with concern. His gaze fell on the pits, and his heart lurched, a visceral recognition of something terribly wrong. "Help us!" Clara cried, her voice breaking through the night. "Please, mister, get us out." Her small hand clawed at the earth, a desperate bid for freedom, and Thomas's eyes widened, the lantern trembling in his grip. Charles, hearing the groundskeeper's voice, seized his chance. "Thomas," he called from the ditch, his tone shifting to one of faint distress. "Thank heaven you're here. The girls, they fell into these holes during a game. I was trying to get them out when that horse attacked me." His words were smooth, practiced, but they rang hollow, undercut by the tremor in his voice. Thomas's brow furrowed, his gaze flicking between Charles' disheveled form and the girl's terrified expressions. He'd known Charles Warrington for years, a cold, ambitious man whose charm masked a ruthless streak. The girls' fear, the dirt piled around them, and Shadow's protective stance told a different story. "A game?" Thomas repeated, his voice thick with skepticism. He stepped closer, the lantern's light catching the shovel abandoned in the grass. "Doesn't look like any game I know." Shadow paused his digging, positioning himself between Thomas and the girls, his ears pinned back, assessing the newcomer. But there was no malice in Thomas's posture, only a grandfatherly concern that softened the stallion's stance. Shadow snorted, as if granting permission, and resumed his work, his hooves clearing dirt from around Clara's chest. "Shadow's helping us," Elise said, her voice steady despite her fear. "Daddy, he put us in here. He said it was a game, but he wasn't going to come back." Her words hung in the air, raw and unfiltered, a child's truth cutting through Charles' lies. Thomas's face hardened, his jaw clenching as he turned toward the ditch. "That true, Mr. Warrington?" he asked, his voice low, dangerous. "You buried your own daughters?" He set the lantern down, his hands balling into fists, the weight of Elise's words settling like a stone in his chest. Charles scrambled to his feet, wincing as his ankle buckled. "They're confused, Thomas," he said, his voice rising with desperation. "Children exaggerate. I was teaching them a lesson, tough love, you know? That horse went wild, knocked me down here. Help me out, and we'll sort this mess." His eyes darted to the shovel, calculating the distance, but Shadow's presence loomed like a sentinel, daring him to try. Thomas ignored Charles, kneeling beside the girls. "You're safe now," he said softly, his calloused hands joining Shadow's efforts, pulling away handfuls of dirt. "No one's gonna hurt you." His touch was gentle, steady, a stark contrast to Charles' cold cruelty. Clara's sobs softened, her eyes meeting Thomas's, finding in them a kindness she'd almost forgotten existed. Shadow worked tirelessly, his hooves and Thomas's hands moving in a silent partnership. The earth yielded, Clara's shoulders emerging, her arms trembling as she pushed against the soil. Elise, now free to her waist, reached for her sister, their fingers brushing above the dirt. "We're getting out," Elise whispered, a spark of defiance in her voice. "Shadow and Mr. Thomas won't let Daddy win." Charles' face contorted with rage, his composure shattering. "You can't take them," he shouted, clawing at the ditch's sides, his injured ankle slowing him. "They're mine, my daughters, my property." The word property echoed, a damning admission that made Thomas's blood run cold. "Property?" Thomas growled, pausing to glare at Charles. "They're children, you heartless bastard." He turned back to the girls, his resolve hardening. "Hold on, little ones. We're almost there." Shadow let out a low whinny, as if urging Thomas to hurry. The stallion's flank bore a red mark where the shovel had struck, but he showed no pain, his focus unwavering. Clara was nearly free, her torso clear, her small body shivering in the cool night air. Thomas lifted her gently, setting her on the grass, and she clung to him, her arms wrapping around his neck. "Clara!" Elise cried, tears of relief streaming down her face. Shadow turned to her, his hooves digging faster, the earth flying as he worked to free the second twin. Thomas joined him, their efforts synchronized, a testament to the bond forged in this moment of crisis. Charles, seeing Clara free, roared in frustration. "You'll regret this, Thomas," he spat, finally hauling himself from the ditch, limping heavily. He lunged for the shovel, raising it with a manic glint in his eyes. "No one takes what's mine." Shadow sensed the threat, spinning with a speed that belied his size. He charged, a black blur of fury, and Thomas shouted, "Look out!" The stallion's shoulder struck Charles' chest, sending him crashing back into the ditch with a cry of pain. The shovel clattered to the ground, and Charles lay still, his breath ragged, his defiance broken. The headlights of Thomas's truck bathed the meadow in a stark glow, the scene frozen in time. Clara safe in Thomas's arms, Elise nearly free, Shadow standing guard, and Charles defeated in the dirt. But the night wasn't over. From the manor, a second set of lights flickered, another vehicle approaching, its engine a distant hum. Thomas looked up, his face grim. "More company," he muttered, his eyes narrowing. He held Clara tighter, his other hand resting on Elise's shoulder. "Stay close, girls." "Shadow, you keep watch." The stallion snorted, his eyes locked on the new lights, ready to protect the girls at any cost. The meadow waited, its secrets unraveling as the next chapter of their fate drew near. Buried secrets. The meadow lay cloaked in the hush of night, its secrets bared under the cold glare of Thomas's truck headlights. The air was thick with the scent of churned earth and unresolved tension, the only sounds the ragged breaths of Elise and Clara and the distant hum of an approaching engine. Shadow, the black stallion, stood sentinel over the girls, his coat gleaming like polished obsidian, his dark eyes fixed on the new lights piercing the trees. Clara clung to Thomas, her small arms wrapped around his neck, while Elise, half freed from her earthen prison, gripped her sister's hand. In the ditch, Charles Warrington lay slumped, his ankle swollen, his charcoal suit a tattered ruin, his plans unraveling like the threads of his own conscience. Thomas worked swiftly, his calloused hands pulling dirt from around Elise's torso, his lantern casting a warm glow over her pale face. "Almost there, little one," he murmured, his voice a steady anchor in the chaos. Shadow snorted softly, his hooves nudging the soil aside with careful precision, a silent partner in the rescue. Elise's chest heaved as the pressure eased, her small body trembling but resolute. "Thank you, Mr. Thomas," she whispered, her eyes flicking to Shadow. "Thank you, Shadow." The approaching vehicle, a sleek black sedan, rolled into the meadow, its engine purring with the arrogance of wealth. The door opened, and Sylvia, Charles' partner, stepped out, her elegant silhouette framed by the headlights. Her crimson dress clung to her like a second skin, her heels sinking into the grass, but her face was a storm of conflicting emotions, anger, guilt, and something softer, almost broken. Her eyes swept the scene. The girls, the stallion, Thomas, and Charles, crumpled in the ditch. "Charles," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "What have you done?" Charles stirred, his head snapping up, a flicker of hope in his bloodshot eyes. "Sylvia, thank God," he croaked, hauling himself upright, wincing at the pain in his ankle. "It's a misunderstanding. The girls got lost, and this old fool and his horse attacked me. Help me get them back." His words were desperate, a final grasp at control, but they faltered under Sylvia's piercing gaze. Thomas stood, placing himself between Sylvia and the girls, his posture protective. "Don't come closer," he warned, his voice low but firm. "These girls told me what he did. Buried them alive, he did. Called it a game." He gestured to the pits, the shovel, the dirt caked on Clara's dress. "You know anything about this?" Sylvia's lips parted, her breath catching. She looked at Elise, now fully freed by Shadow's and Thomas's efforts, crawling to her sister's side. The twins hugged, their sobs muffled against each other, their small bodies shaking. Shadow positioned himself beside them, his massive frame a living shield, his eyes locked on Sylvia, assessing her intent. I suspected," Sylvia admitted, her voice trembling, a crack in her polished facade. "Charles said the girls were a burden tied to his late wife's fortune. He said we needed a clean start." Her gaze dropped, shame etching her features. "I didn't ask questions. I didn't want to know. But this," she gestured to the pits, her hand shaking. "This is monstrous." Charles' face contorted, rage overtaking his pain. "You traitor," he roared, clawing at the ditch's edge. "You wanted this as much as I did. A life without them, without complications." He tried to stand, but Shadow snorted, stomping a hoof, the sound a warning that froze Charles in place. Sylvia shook her head, tears swelling in her eyes. "I wanted a future, Charles, not a crime." She pulled a phone from her purse, her fingers trembling as she dialed. "I'm calling the police." "This ends now." "No." Charles lunged from the ditch, his limp slowing him, but his desperation lending him strength. He aimed for Sylvia, his hands outstretched, but Shadow was faster. The stallion charged, a black blur of righteous fury, his shoulders slamming into Charles' chest. The man collapsed, gasping, his face pressed into the dirt, his fight drained. Thomas lifted Elise, holding both girls close, their small bodies shivering against his warmth. "You're safe now," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "No one's taking you anywhere." Shadow returned to the girls, lowering his head to nuzzle their faces, his warm breath a comfort. Clara stroked his muzzle, whispering, "You're our hero, Shadow." Sylvia spoke into the phone, her voice steady despite her tears. "Yes, it's an emergency. Warrington Estate, the meadow. Attempted murder of 2 children." She glanced at Charles, her expression a mix of disgust and resolve. "The father's here. He's not going anywhere." As she hung up, Sylvia approached the girls, kneeling despite the mud staining her dress. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I should have stopped him sooner. I didn't know, not this." Elise looked at her, eyes wary but softening. "You're helping us now," she said simply, her child's wisdom cutting through Sylvia's guilt. The meadow grew quiet, the sedan's headlights mingling with Thomas's lantern, casting a surreal glow over the scene. Police sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder, a promise of justice. Charles lay defeated, his dreams of wealth and freedom buried in the same earth he'd used against his daughters. Months later, the meadow bloomed with wildflowers, a riot of color where terror once reigned. Elise and Clara ran through the grass, their laughter a melody of renewal, their blue dresses replaced with bright overalls. Shadow galloped beside them, his mane flowing, his eyes bright with joy. Thomas watched from the porch of his modest cottage, now the girl's home, his heart full. The adoption papers had been signed, Sylvia's testimony ensuring Charles faced prison, his fortune seized. "Grandpa Thomas," Clara called, waving a daisy. "Shadow says we need a picnic." Thomas chuckled, descending the steps, his limp a reminder of that night's struggle. "Shadow's got good ideas," he said, ruffling her hair. Elise hugged Shadow's neck, her face glowing. "He saved us, Grandpa. He saw everything and did something." Shadow snorted, nuzzling her back, a bond forged in crisis now a cornerstone of their family. As the sun set, painting the sky in hues of hope, the meadow stood as a testament to resilience. Where there was once betrayal, there was now love. Where there was fear, there was safety. The girls, Thomas and Shadow, had found a new beginning, their story not of an ending, but of a life reclaimed, guarded by a horse whose courage had rewritten their fate. Fade to black, the meadow alive with laughter and hoofbeats, a family born from the ashes of cruelty.